So thank you so much for joining us this morning. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name's Kayleen Harrington. I've recently joined the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce and I'll be looking after all their virtual event offerings moving forward. So I hope you're enjoying our virtual event offerings and thank you so much for joining us on Friday morning. I'm excited to let you know that we have recently launched a brand new recovery program virtual event which supports businesses to restart, rebuild and renew. Our first event is on Friday, the 11th of September at 11, and we'll focus on developing a resilient mindset. I'll put a link to this along with our events link in the chat function, so feel free to view this after the webinar and book on any. They're completely free to attend. So, serendipity is the coming together of chance and a system ready to make the most of that chance. The role of serendipity in innovation and business development has been identified through stories. We all have a tale about a lucky break that made us. However, the past decade has seen an increase in scientific research on how we can better harness the skill of serendipity. This webinar will give you practical skills for developing serendipity and how you can better deal with uncertainty. In this 45-minute webinar with Wendy Ross, lecturer and researcher from Kingston University, Wendy will introduce you to the scientific concept of serendipity or smart luck and to demonstrate practical ways that you can cultivate this in your workspace. You're welcome to ask her questions during the presentation. There'll also be a live Q&A afterwards. So please use the Q&A function when you have any questions. So, Wendy, over to you.
Let's get my screen shared. Hi everybody. I hope you can. I hope I'm probably showing the wrong screen because that's what tends to happen on these things. You rehearse them, don't you? And then you share the wrong one. There we go. That looks much better. Hi everybody. I'm super interested actually to see how many mining engineer people were in the chat there. One of the things that I just was reading just this week was the role of serendipity in mining and geological discovery. Unfortunately, it's not something I'm going to deal with today. Had I known, maybe I would have put something in. What I'm going to be looking at today is really different ways that you can use strategies and some of the research that's coming out through scientific study into innovation to develop things for strategies in your organization. I'm going to be thinking about what breeds success. Is it an individual? Is it a company? Does it become a combination of hard work or the right people, or is it just sometimes catching that lucky break? Why is it that sometimes the right idea just falls flat and other times it catches a zeitgeist and it's successful? I mean, these are infinitely complex questions and they're not something that we can answer directly or straight away. But what we're starting to do as research is developing over the past decade or so is to look at ways that we can engage with uncertainty, engage with zeitgeist and engage with luck and build strategies that we can better use that. My name's Wendy Ross. I'm a researcher at Kingston University, London. I work mainly in cognitive psychology, actually, and I tend to have a look at how people engage with luck when they're in the cognitive psychologist lab. But I'm reaching out more and more to look at how luck develops within organizations, because what I've noticed is that most of the time when we encounter lucky events, we don't tend to make the most use of it. In fact, what we need to have around us is a system to build that luck around us. What I want to be able to do is to find the small moments in life which can have a really large long-term impact on us, the things that we tend not to notice, but actually go on to change the way that we go through life. These moments include meeting with people or engaging with objects. And I'm trying to find out how luck contributes to creativity and problem solving in various different organizations, from small ones to larger ones, and how we can best position ourselves to be able to exploit lucky breaks. What I'm going to look at over the next sort of 25 minutes, half an hour, is how we can develop these strategies for serendipity and innovation within our own personal lives, but also hopefully within the organizations and structures that you're coming from. I'm going to take a look at what is serendipity and why is it important. I'm going to introduce you to the notion of information encountering. We're going to have a discussion possibly about what's happened to serendipity during COVID-19 and over the last 6 months. There's been a lot of reports that times for serendipity has gone down and opportunities for serendipity have been massively reduced. But I want us to start thinking about different ways that we can engage with those ideas, and perhaps there are actually more opportunities for serendipity in our new online world. I'd like to flag up this particular book. A lot of the work that I think about has been inspired by the writer that's written this book. And this book was actually published yesterday by Dr. Christian Bush. It came out, and I think it's a really useful thing for you to go and pick up. I will pop a link to it in the chat. And within this, much longer and a bigger development of these ideas, Dr. Bush talks about developing this serendipity mindset, which allows us to see triggers, connect the dots, and have the tenacity to see them through. And it's this idea of seeing serendipitous triggers, connecting the dots between them, and how we can build the tenacity as individuals, but also as organizations to see them through, that I'd like to take you through today. So what is serendipity? That's probably the first thing we really need to get established. What I tend to find if I tell people I'm a serendipity researcher is I find out how people met their partner almost every single time. Everybody has a serendipitous story about how they met their partner. Occasionally it turns slightly less serendipitous as they tell me how that disintegrated, but most of the time people met their partner in a serendipitous way. I also hear that serendipity is a film. I tend to hear that quite a lot, and I get to hear about how the closing doors moments of serendipity. And generally within our culture, we view serendipity as being a happy event, something good that happens to us. But actually, when we look at serendipity scientifically, it has a very precise meaning. And serendipity is a mixture of accident and sagacity. Again, both those things need to be present for a serendipitous moment to happen. Now, when I talk about accidents, what I mean here is just anything that is unplanned. So anything that happens to us, it doesn't have to be a negative occasion, it can be a positive occasion, it can be negative or it can be neutral. But the essential element is it's unplanned and unexpected. Something happens that we are not expecting, that we're not looking forward to. And sagacity actually means your wisdom. It's your ability to take advantage of the situation. So what we have when we have serendipity is it's about an unsought finding. It's something that we were not expecting, but which then benefits us. It's something that we weren't looking for, but which we then find. So the two things need to be put in place. We need to not be looking for it. It needs to be accidental, but then we also need to find it and we need to engage with it for it to be truly serendipitous. So in that way, it's massively freeing as a concept. It's not blind luck. It's not just being at the whim of the people and the luck and the chance around us, but it's rather luck which we then use and exploit. So it allows us to exert some control over the luck, whether it's good luck or bad luck, that we find in life. What does serendipity look like when we're within an organization or when we're within our own lives? Well, a really good example is the invention of the Post-it note. The invention of the Post-it note, it's quite a long story, and it has a series of accidents in it, and it also has a series of moments of organizational sagacity. So there are actually two main accidents that led to the invention of the Post-it note. The first was by Spencer Silver. Spencer Silver was working at 3M, and he was tasked with creating a super strong adhesive for use in the aerospace industry, so in building planes. And what he actually came up with was the adhesive we find on the back of Post-it notes, which, as you can imagine, is not massively useful if you're trying to build a plane. I mean, nobody's particularly going to want to have a plane that's held together with that really weak glue. And in fact, there was no real use for it. So even though he had created this particular sort of adhesive, it had two really good features. It could stick to any surface and be peeled away without leaving a residue, and that it was reusable. For what it was actually designed for, it was pretty pointless. Nobody is going to want their plane to be held up by Post-it notes. And so for several years, he just floated it around. He thought it was cool, but he had no use for it, this accidental invention. Somebody else then in 3M picked up on it, heard about it. This particular person was a really, really keen choirist, choral singer, and would spend a lot of time losing pages in the books, apparently, and suddenly realized that he could use this paper to stick his sticky marker into his book. And so what he managed to do from this is to invent the post-it note, from the adhesive that came from silver all the way through to Fry, who invented the actual post-it note. These notes then floated around 3M for 2 or 3 years, but they were unkeen to market them until eventually their value was seen and they were marketed to all of us. And now they're ubiquitous across all offices that they used to be in the pre-COVID world. What we have then is a mixture of accident, an accidental invention, an accidental spotting, but we also have an organizational sagacity, people that were in a place to take position and to use that accident to help them. What does innovation look like, and how does innovation happen? Well, we're now starting to make really quite rapid progress on how innovation unfolds in organizations. And that's partly because we've lost this image here that you can see here of the lone genius, of the scientists in the lab on their own. A lot of the psychological research on innovation used to just look at the characteristics of one person. Is it because that person is particularly clever? Is it because that person is particularly good at making connections? But it's become increasingly apparent that that's not how innovation works. That actually innovation isn't the thinking of one sole genius, but rather it occurs in and it's supported by a broad social network. And so it maps very nicely onto serendipity, because the two things need to have this network for them to occur. It's no use having just an idea just nowhere. It's no use an accident happening. Instead, we have to start thinking about the way that networks foster these particular arrangements. Why is serendipity important to innovation? Well, it's unclear at the moment exactly how many of the scientific inventions and how much innovation comes from serendipitous discoveries. The most recent study suggests it was slightly under 10% that are reported in scientific papers will report serendipity as their main reason for their discovery. Innovation, it seems quite likely that it's a major cause of innovation in business as well, in part just because the number of anecdotal stories that people will say, oh, I came across this, or I saw this. But again, it's not something that's been deeply researched. And the reason is because what we tend to do is we tend to create a much smoother narrative, which is partly why the research that I do and the research that colleagues around me do tries to watch innovation unfold in real time. When we put innovation in real time, we see that these stories of backwards and forwards, some planning, some mistakes, some failures, the way we react to external volatility, they're smoothed out afterwards, but actually during the course of innovation, they're all there. And it seems quite likely that serendipity is going to be a major factor in most innovation. So the stories that we tend to tell are of success rather than of failure. But what I'd like you to see over the course of this presentation is that success and failure can sometimes be quite intimately bound up with each other. Probably the most famous example of serendipity is Alexander Fleming and his discovery of penicillin. It's the one that comes up nearly all the time, and I think it's the one we all know about. Alexander Fleming, who was a scientist, a messy scientist, used to look at his own mucus, put it in Petri dishes, never washed anything up, went off on holiday. It was Christmas. It was a really warm Christmas, much warmer than it should ever have been. And some spores floated up from the asthma lab below. And when he came back from holiday, he found that a certain sort of mold had grown on some of his dirty Petri dishes, and they'd killed some of the bacteria that he had been growing there. 10 years later, this was picked up by the Oxford pathologist Howard Florey. He discovered his research and expanded it with someone called Boris Chain, who had just fled Germany. They managed to create and mass produce an antibiotic. And the antibiotic was ready in 1942. So it was just in time to really save some of the lives of people that were fighting the Second World War. So what happened was this one accident, going off, not bothering to wash up your Petri dishes, this accident created a chain of events which saved hundreds of thousands of lives since the invention of penicillin. Now the story we hear smooths over, exactly as I've just said, smooths over the different types of discovery and iteration that went on. And it also undermines to some extent the importance of network in the discovery of penicillin. So yes, a mouldy Petri dish contaminated by spores from the asthma lab below over an unusually warm Christmas break, that was the center point. That's the first time that penicillin was grown and identified. But what happened was that Fleming noticed it. That was important. We need to notice these things that happen in the environment. And straight away, he remarked on it to his assistant Hunt. So he turned to his Hunt and he took that idea and he solidified it. Then he sent these ideas to other labs all around the world. He published about it in scientific journals. It was brought up by Florian Chain's lab. They saw it. They had the skills that Fleming's lab didn't have. They had the skills to develop it. They had the skills to push it further. And finally, the only way that it could be cultivated in such large numbers was because of the efforts of a researcher in America, Mary Hunt. And she found just the perfect mold for it to be cultivated on that was cheap enough for mass production. And this all happened just in time for D-Day. So the American government was really, really interested in supporting it financially. So what we see is that there's one story of accident that we feel we can't possibly harness, because how can you predict or create an accident of a random spore floating up on an unseasonably warm day? Actually, that accident is only important because of the network within which it grows. So from the point of view of what you should be doing and you should be thinking about within your businesses, is you should be fostering this culture of talk. Some of the ideas that are going to come up are going to fall flat. Some of the times that Fleming would have remarked to his assistant, they're not necessarily going to be taken up. But without a culture of talk, without a culture of ideas being spread, you'll have no idea which ones come up. Remember also that to do that, then you need cognitive diversity. The more things and the more different types of people that rub up against each other, the more types of things can spark accidents. So innovations can come from these different perspectives combining. And you can increase opportunities for serendipity by increasing the diversity of your team. You see that I've got a picture of a fruit salad and a smoothie. It's particularly useful for team diversity to think about it in that way. If you have lots of different types of fruit, you can actually influence each other much more than if you become one smoothie mix. The other thing that you need to do is foster networks beyond your immediate team. There's no way that penicillin could have developed the way it was unless there was a great big scientific network. Skill diversity and diversity of outlet is easier to maintain by creating these collaborative networks. I want to talk a little bit as well about information encountering, because much of the research in serendipity has been done in this field of information seeking. What's happened really over the past sort of 20 years is we've moved away from bumping into information, if you like, to having information curated for us. This has some interesting aspects, but it also can be quite dangerous in terms of how little we can encounter serendipity in this way. So a lot of the work that's been done on how we encounter information has been looking at this idea that possibly we need to bump into information in a much more unplanned way. A lot of the work's been done by Professor Sandra Erdeles, and she's come up with the main talk about a super encounterer, as we like to call it. And this is a skill that we can all foster and we can all think about doing. And it's very, very closely related to serendipity. So what is a super encounterer? Well, information and opportunities are available constantly to us. We're always there with every time we step out of the door, we pick up our phone, we switch on our computer, we have a junk email, constantly available. Part of what we have to learn to do to develop is how to filter and how to choose these different opportunities, this different information. What Professor Erdeles saw was there are 4 types of people when they deal with this information that we're not used to, we're not planned, and we haven't sought. The first sort of people are the non-encounterers. So non-encounterers will only really deal with information that's tailored to them and that they have sought. So if they need information, they will go out and find it, but they will not really take advantage of it when it appears in the environment. There are occasional encounterers. These are people that will occasionally pick up information, but their main thing that they do is they look for the information that is tailored to them. Then we have encounterers. Most of us fall into this group. We'll see something, it will spark an idea, but mainly we're out looking and filtering through information to already fit into our mindset. But the fourth group of people who are quite interesting in terms of fostering diversity within your teams, and also quite interesting in terms of recruiting and trying to build and learn from, are these people called the super encounterers. Now, a super encounterer, they have a very wide appreciation of information. And so they actually really value just bumping into information as a method of learning, as a method of obtaining the information that they need. They're the people that are far more likely to draw random connections from one thing to another, because their ideas of what an idea might be, or what information might be, and of what usefulness might be, are much, much broader. They also, interestingly and usefully, for those of us that aren't super encounterers, they also don't just find information from themselves, but they also find them for their family, friends, and colleagues. So in fact, those people who are super encounterers are very useful to have around. They will tend to, because of their broad ideas about what makes information useful, they will tend to foster serendipity around them all the time, because they'll be there, an accidental piece of information will come up, they'll think of somebody that it refers to, and they'll go and talk to them. What can you do to help these people in your business and to help develop these skills for yourself? Well, you can step outside of your information bubble. You can read a different newspaper, read a different blog, click on the bit that you wouldn't necessarily click on, pick something up and browse through it. How many times when we used to sit in doctor's surgeries and we were allowed to have the magazines, would you pick it up and you'd see something you weren't used to? Expose yourself in a greater way to these ideas. Value information within your organization. Encourage the people who work for you to be information seekers, to go out and to look and to bump into different things. Encourage that diversity of opinion and that diversity of seeking behaviors. And encourage sharing. The great things about super encounterers is that they often encounter information which is useful for others. And this can only happen if they know and understand other people's interests. So build on those people, allow there to be a culture of talk within your organization, and these happy accidents will occur much more naturally. Oh, apologies. So I would have gone on far too long if I had to keep that one in. So the other thing that we need to think about, and that you need to be careful about when designing and thinking about strategies for serendipity, is that serendipity and innovation requires some level of failure. If we think back to the Post-it note, the initial start of the Post-it note was a story of failure, but also a story of tenacity. The models of innovation and growth that we're seeing, they're not consistent. It's not a consistent linear trajectory. So it does not map onto how it happens in the real world. There's only textbooks examples of it. And every organization's tolerance for investment in failure is different. So it's worth having conversations about what counts as a safe failure. What are the limits that your organization can have to allow people to explore things and also allow them to go wrong? Because there are risks in serendipity that it's always worth considering. We talk a lot about chance favors only the prepared mind. And it's absolutely true that when you prepare your mind and you prepare your organization to take advantage of risk and chance in the environment, then you are in a much better position. But it also requires having to take that risk. And so preparing your organization means preparing for safe failure, and it also means preparing for risk. And that does mean there is a chance it's not going to work, because luck can be bad luck and it can be good luck. So openness and preparation are both key to exploiting chance. So the real lesson from serendipity is that you don't just expose yourself to luck, but you do so in a prepared way, ready and able to take opportunities. So what you then need to do is you need to look at your failures and confront your failures. So preparation for serendipity comes about as much from dissecting and dealing with failure as it does from dealing with success. The last thing I wanted to touch upon today was the threats to serendipity that have been posed by the place we find ourselves now under the lockdowns and the various different things that are going on. I've just heard there's likely to be a local lockdown the day my children have gone back to school. And these are the threats that have just been posed by the way our world has changed so dramatically in the last 6 months. And headlines like this one, how remote work could destroy Silicon Valley, are all over the place. And we hear an awful lot about how serendipity is just not going to occur because we don't have a chance to do it. And I've just talked to you an awful lot about how we need to have networks, how we need to foster safe spaces for talking, and yet we're all remote and we're all one step back behind these computer screens. And so we have an area where we're much more isolated, where we have lack of physical manipulation of objects, lack of physical manipulation. You can't sit over somebody's shoulder and draw out for them what you're thinking in the same way as we used to. What's happened to our water cooler conversations? What's happened to our corridor chats? What's happened to coming to a meeting at the Norfolk Chamber of Commerce and seeing someone you haven't seen for a while and taking them for a coffee afterwards? Well, that's not going to happen anymore. We're all under massive time pressures. We can't, all of a sudden, when we're juggling homeschooling or we're juggling different work that's happening, we're trying to do it all. We can't have just a 5-minute conversation. Instead, we have to have a 10-minute online meeting. And we do have different financial pressures and risks. Everybody is facing a very turbulent 12 to 18 months, if not longer, with all the various different things that are going to happen. And how can we, in those times when I've talked about safe failures, or when I've talked about taking risks, I've talked about diversity, how can we use those things in this particular world? Well, I have a few suggestions. I'm not as pessimistic about the role of serendipity in the new world as many commentators are. There are various things you can do. It's worth looking up, and in the notes that are sent out afterwards, I'll send more of this. These things called randomized coffee trials, they're happening all around the world, but you can do them within your organization or across organizations, and it simply matches different people and gets them to have half an hour to have coffee with each other. It used to be in person. Now it's online, but the same thing works. And in fact, the work that we've seen is more people are engaging with it online because it's less effort to go out for half an hour and to meet strange people and to have those conversations. Think about how you structure meetings. There's nothing worse than when everybody says goodbye and you're all doing this because you're all looking for the stop share button and you can't quite see it and nobody's really making eye contact with each other in the same way. But when you're structuring meetings, it can be really easy to just have 1 or 2 people that are always going to be there until the very end, leaving it open, allowing a little bit of more space for a conversation that's not planned. Take advantage to invite and speak to different people. Actually, all of a sudden, you can find yourself talking to people thousands of miles away that you wouldn't have been able to before because it would have been too expensive or too difficult to speak to them. To take advantage. I'm talking in Arizona in 2 weeks' time at 1 o'clock in the morning, which I never would have been before because there would have been no way I would have thought of doing it. But within this world, you can start talking and making these opportunities. I know there's so many things like this happening, so many wonderful things that are being put in place, so many webinars, so many interesting things are being put in place for free. So we can take advantage of these things. But also do allow time to explore and take risks, but just make them smart risks. Right now, it might be that the side of being a prepared mind is more important than the side of accidents. It might be that we need to take more time to do our research, to invest more in those people that can support it and allow us to do that. And do keep time for the blue skies thinking. Try to realize that it's really important and it might be the thing that gets us out of some of these things. Invite people around you to think about and to link unusual activities. Even just the little chats that were done at the start of this can be a way of fostering and getting different ideas flowing. So finally, I just wanted to finish off then by summarizing that serendipity is about using the unsought and the unexpected absolutely to your advantage. It isn't about just having to confront luck, but realizing that you can be prepared for it by building networks, by building teams which are diverse, and by going out and engaging with information. It's realizing that we cannot always control what happens, but we can control our reactions to it. That we should foster networks of skills and diversity within organizations and beyond them. We should make those links so that we can share these things. We should allow space to try out ideas, but recall that they might not always work, and that's part of the whole system. And we should allow space for safe failure, whatever that might look like to our organization, and often that's going to be quite individual. And yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Sorry, I clicked my unmute button 3 times and then it finally unmuted. Thanks. I found that so fascinating. We haven't received, oh, I say that and then a question pops in. So I love the timing of that. As I said in the chat function and beforehand, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A function. So the first one we've got is from Michelle. Have you looked into how serendipity works with the administration of statutory processes, where there is arguably less leeway for innovation than in organisations not ruled by statutory processes?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't looked at it in serendipity particularly. I know that what sort of, it's hard, you can't really talk back in these forums, can you? I was thinking about
if you press the Q&A, you should be able to see the question.
I can see the question. I was wondering what sort of statutory processes. I mean, there's always constraints on innovation, and some constraints will enhance innovation. But statutory process, obviously, they're just the things you have to follow. Like I said right at the start with the mini rugby that we're doing, there's only so much you can innovate within something that's there for health or for health and safety reasons. But it's not something that I've really thought about in terms of really those sort of how you would innovate within really strict statutory regulations. No.
So Michelle has come back and said town planning application processing.
Okay, I know nothing about town planning, but that does sound super interesting. And I've definitely, the only thing I can think of is I've seen loads of people try to get around a lot of the planning things for extensions and things around where I am. No, but it's yeah, and sometimes as well the problems that you can have is that you're working with you're working within something which is already set, and we tend to there's a great deal of path dependency in innovation. So because innovation is incremental, what we see is that we'll go down one route, so the way a town is planned, for example, and people will just keep slowly changing it. But the slowly changing it can sometimes, you're absolutely right, actually you can turn around, and if you look step back and look to as a whole, the whole thing wouldn't necessarily work. That stepping back and looking at it as a whole is really, really difficult because it involves a massive amount of disruption. But I think that it can be quite useful, but on terms of a big town, obviously that's a lot harder. Yeah. I can see that Ben's got a question.
Yeah, how best to protect the agents working in this way? Change is disruptive and can be hard on all, but mostly on the individual who needs to be mentally robust.
I think that's really true. And I think that because along with change comes uncertainty. There's some work being done on uncertainty that talks about 3 different sorts of uncertainty. There's the uncertainty that hang on, I have a train, I live on a train line, so that's uncertain and serendipitous. I'll wait for that to go past. And it's a very long train, clearly, as it seems to be. So you have this sort of uncertainty that you engage with in your everyday life, and we all engage with uncertainty at any point in time. You have then you have the really big uncertainty, and the really big uncertainty is the most psychologically disruptive. And I think all of us are living in that really big uncertain world at the moment, where we're not really 100% sure what's going to happen at Christmas. You know, we like to hear that, we like to listen to some people that will say it's all going to be great and we're all just going to be all sat around together. And then there's other people that talk about it's all being back in lockdown. And that sort of uncertainty is psychologically destabilizing. Often, though, we tend to just ignore that one. We tend to get used to it in a way that's actually probably slightly more disturbing if you ever want to think about it long term. The one that's interesting is what we call actionable uncertainty. So actionable uncertainty is when something's uncertain, you're in an uncomfortable state, but you can do things to make that state go away. And I think what you're talking about then is agents that are constantly in this state of actionable uncertainty. So they do something, but it carries on keeping them in this unstable state. I actually really recommend Christian's book on the serendipity mindset and how you can develop a way to look at that change and look at that uncertainty. And it looked like you had a really good webinar on that next week on developing a mindset for resilience. Yeah, I think it's allowing people to have control over that level of actionable uncertainty. But I agree with you, it is hard, and it's not for everybody. And that's part of the benefit of developing a diverse team. Some people are much better at dealing with uncertainty and other people aren't. And you kind of need all of them, I think.
Perfect, thank you. I can't see any more questions, so I'm just going to check that there are no more questions that people want to ask before we thank you all and say goodbye. I know we've got 5 minutes to spare. Oh. Okay, so Ben's come back with, are there any suggestions on how an organisation can measure the success for this approach? Easy to measure internal costs for those involved, but then just judging against income in the future is harder.
Yeah, I think this is one of the problems with one of these approaches, is that it's not always the cost effectiveness isn't always necessarily clear. And certainly because of this idea of safe failure, and it can be very uncertain which thing is going to be a failure, which thing is going to be a success. And I would love to be able to say you can definitely do this, this and this, and this will definitely lead to this, this and this outcome. I think we'd all really like that. I'm not convinced at the moment that the science can give that answer to you, I'm afraid. But it is one of the things that we're trying to unpick, is exactly how we can make it more likely that you will have a cost benefit from this.
Thank you. He's also asked, is there another suggested metric?
So we could talk about, talking about things in terms of sort of employee retention rather than cost and benefit.
We'll come back to that. We'll see what he comes back with. So TK has said, this is not a question, but a comment to say that the government has research and development expenditure relief where companies develop new projects.
And I can see that Patrick has said about how do you best deal with maximising the chance of serendipity in cases where there are many variables. Yeah, and this is where actually your natural super encounters are pretty good, but they quite often look quite scatty. This is the problem with super encounters. They look like they have too much information, but they're pretty good at filtering it. There are various strategies you can put in place, so you can almost plan for serendipity by removing some of the information, by giving yourself set times to look at information, so you're not in a constant sort of information overload. Yeah, so those are things that are useful. But I agree that there is always a balance between taking in too much, and that's the point about setting the boundaries around sometimes the time things can help with that.
Perfect, thank you. I think that's all the questions. If any pops up while we say goodbye, I'll then ask you. So yeah, it's just to say a massive thank you to Wendy. I hope everyone found that as fascinating as I did. Like Wendy said, I'll share the presentation with you this afternoon. Wendy just wants to provide some more information. So yeah, I'll share the presentation along with some useful links and information this afternoon. Also, the recording will be available next week. So as soon as that's done and ready, I'll forward it on to everyone that's kindly attended. So yeah, it's just to say a massive thank you, Wendy. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say before we end the session.
No, thank you. Have a good weekend.
Yes, I hope everyone has a nice weekend too, and that it's a lot better than last Saturday. So yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend. It sounds like you all have amazing plans. Good luck. I can't remember who it was with the house move. Good luck with the rugby, Wendy and Richard. Yeah, have a great time. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. See you later.